Walk the sacred path of gods and kings. Feel the vibrant pulse of history. Witness the crowning glory of an step into a world where legends were born. Walk the sacred path of gods and kings. Feel the vibrant pulse of history. Witness the crowning glory of an Imagine standing before walls so enormous they seem impossible to build. Ahead rises a brilliant blue gate, covered in golden dragons and bulls.
One of the greatest cities humanity ever built. Today, we're going to walk through it exactly as it may have appeared at its greatest moment. A living, breathing testament to human achievement. One of the greatest cities humanity ever built. Today, we're going to walk through it exactly as it may have appeared at its greatest moment. Behold the Acropolis, the crown of Athens, a testament to human achievement.
Stand in the middle of modern Iraq and look carefully at the landscape stretching around you. Flat, dry, sun-baked earth extending toward every horizon, occasionally broken by low mounds of compacted soil whose unremarkable appearance conceals one of the most extraordinary secrets in human history. Beneath those mounds lie the ruins of cities so ancient that when they were already old, Egypt was still young. The landscape now called Mesopotamia, the Greek word meaning the land between the rivers, sits between the Tigris and Euphrates, two great rivers descending from the mountains of modern Turkey through the flat plains of Iraq toward the Persian Gulf. This territory received something that most of the ancient world could not reliably count on: water. Annual floods deposited layers of dark, mineral-rich silt across the surrounding plains, creating some of the most productive farmland on Earth in the middle of what would otherwise be desert. Communities settled here as early as 6,000 years ago, discovering that this soil, properly managed and irrigated, could support population densities and food surpluses that no other environment of the period could match. Where surplus food accumulated, specialization followed. Where specialization followed, cities grew. And where cities grew, civilization invented itself, piece by piece, across centuries of accumulated human ingenuity. Out of this fertile landscape, dozens of cities rose and fell, but one would eventually rise above all the others. One city was about to claim the ancient world's most extraordinary destiny. Babylon's origins were modest in ways that its eventual magnificence makes almost impossible to imagine. Archaeological evidence traces continuous settlement at the site on the Euphrates River roughly 55 miles south of modern Baghdad, back at least to the 3rd millennium BC, when it existed as a relatively minor administrative center within the broader cultural zone dominated by the great Sumerian cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur further south. It had a temple, it had a market, it had the organized community life that river-based Mesopotamian civilization had developed over centuries. What it did not yet have was power, prestige, or the kind of historical significance that would eventually make its very name synonymous with human ambition and achievement across 3,000 years of subsequent history. The city sat at a natural crossing point on the Euphrates where trade routes converged, a geographic advantage that gradually attracted merchants, craftspeople, and administrators whose accumulated presence transformed a modest settlement into a genuine urban center. When the Amorite dynasty established control over the city around 1894 BC, founding what historians call the Old Babylonian period, they inherited a community already positioned to exploit its geographic advantages in ways that previous rulers had only partially realized. The real question was not whether Babylon could grow, but how far it could grow, and how quickly. A powerful king was coming who would answer that question with a decisiveness that the ancient world had never quite seen before. Hammurabi ruled Babylon from approximately 1792 to 1750 BC, and his reign transformed the city from a regional power into the dominant force of the entire Mesopotamian world through a combination of military campaigning, diplomatic maneuvering, and administrative innovation that made him one of the ancient world's most consequential rulers. His military campaigns systematically eliminated rival powers, Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, bringing their territories under Babylonian control and creating an empire stretching across the entirety of Mesopotamia from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. But Hammurabi's most enduring contribution was not military. it was legal. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black diorite stele nearly 8 feet tall and now housed in the Louvre in Paris, compiled 282 laws governing commercial transactions, property rights, family relationships, professional obligations, and criminal penalties, with a systematicness and specificity that had no real precedent in previous legal traditions. The Stile's prologue declared that Hammurabi had been chosen by the gods to bring justice to his land, and the laws that followed represented a genuine attempt to establish consistent, publicly known standards for resolving the disputes that inevitably arose in a complex urban society. Merchants knew what contracts were enforceable. Laborers knew what wages they could claim. Citizens knew what punishments various crimes carried. This predictability, the sense that society operated according to rules rather than the arbitrary will of whoever held power in the moment, was itself a civilizational achievement of the first order. Babylon's greatest age, however, still lay centuries ahead. The centuries following Hammurabi's death brought Babylon periods of weakness and foreign domination. The Kassites ruled for over 4 centuries. The Assyrians invaded and sacked the city more than once before the Neo-Babylonian Empire that emerged in the late 7th century BCE finally gave Babylon its most spectacular chapter. The empire's founding came through the remarkable partnership of Nabopolassar, who destroyed the Assyrian Empire in alliance with the Medes, and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, who inherited a vast empire and the ambition to make its capital the most magnificent city on earth. Nebuchadnezzar II's reign from 605 to 562 BC represents the period that defines Babylon in historical imagination, the city at its absolute peak of power, wealth, and architectural achievement. He launched construction programs of extraordinary scale and duration, systematically rebuilding Babylon's walls, palaces, temples, and public buildings on a scale that contemporary visitors described with an awe that, even accounting for ancient tendency toward exaggeration, clearly reflected genuine architectural achievement. The resources flowing into Babylon, from an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, tribute, trade revenue, the labor of conquered peoples funded construction campaigns whose physical results were visible from enormous distances across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The city that was emerging from these decades of intensive construction was genuinely unlike anything the ancient world had previously produced. Its walls were astonishing, and beyond those walls lay something even more extraordinary. Approach Babylon from the north along the Euphrates in the 6th century BC, and the first thing that seized your attention, even before the city's famous walls became fully visible, was the Ishtar Gate. Named for the Babylonian goddess of love and war, the gate rose approximately 40 feet into the sky, its surface covered from base to summit in glazed bricks of a blue so intensely vivid that ancient sources consistently described it as almost supernaturally brilliant against the desert landscape surrounding it. The blue was not uniform, but layered, with deep lapis lazuli tones in shadow and brighter turquoise in direct sunlight, creating an effect that shifted as the angle of illumination changed throughout the day. Against this extraordinary blue background, 2 animals marched in alternating rows around the gate's entire surface. The dragon, or mushushu, with its serpentine neck, lion's forelegs, eagle's claws, and horned head, the sacred symbol of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, and the aurochs bull, massive-shouldered and powerful, sacred to the storm god Adad. These creatures had been modeled in raised relief so that they seemed almost 3-dimensional, their forms pressing outward from the blue surface with a presence that would have seemed miraculous to any traveler encountering this technology for the first time. Reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate, now partially displayed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, gives modern visitors their clearest experience of ancient Babylon's visual power. What lay beyond those brilliant blue walls was even more impressive. Through the Ishtar Gate, the Processional Way opened before the visitor like a canyon of color and celebration. This broad ceremonial avenue, approximately 60 feet wide and paved with limestone slabs imported from considerable distances, ran for nearly a mile through Babylon's heart, connecting the northern gate to the great temple complex of Esagila and the towering Etemenanki ziggurat at the city's religious center. The avenue's flanking walls, rising perhaps 25 feet on either side, bore their own glazed brick decorations. Rows of lions in yellow, red, and white against the same deep blue background as the Ishtar Gate, 56 of them marching in solemn procession on each side, totaling 120 lions, watching every person who passed through this ceremonial corridor. During the Akitu festival, Babylon's greatest religious celebration, held at the New Year, the Processional Way became the stage for one of the ancient world's most spectacular public events. The statue of Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity, was carried in a great ceremonial procession from his temple at Esagila northward through the city and out through the Ishtar Gate to a festival house on the plains beyond the walls, while the city's entire population turned out to witness, participate, and celebrate the renewal of divine favor for another year. The king himself participated, grasping the hands of the Marduk statue in a ritual that renewed both the god's blessing and the ruler's legitimacy. The royal palace was coming into view ahead. Nebuchadnezzar's royal palace complex dominated Babylon's northeastern quarter, with a presence that contemporary sources and archaeological evidence both confirm was genuinely overwhelming in scale and elaborateness. The complex covered an area of approximately 4 acres, organized around 5 successive courtyards of increasing formality and restricted access, each one filtering visitors through progressively more impressive architectural spaces until only the most important guests and officials reached the innermost throne room where Nebuchadnezzar himself conducted formal audiences. The throne room's facade, approximately 170 feet wide, bore glazed brick decoration of extraordinary complexity, lions, palms, and geometric borders in multiple colors, creating a visual composition of royal majesty that would have communicated power immediately and unmistakably to anyone brought before the king. The palace's administrative sections contained the bureaucratic apparatus necessary for governing a vast empire: archives of clay tablets recording tax receipts, diplomatic correspondence, military supplies, and the 1,000 details of imperial administration. Warehouses stored tribute goods arriving from throughout the empire's territories. Quarters housed the palace's permanent staff of administrators, guards, craftspeople, and servants whose work kept the complex functioning continuously. Ancient sources, including the Hebrew Bible's accounts of Nebuchadnezzar receiving foreign dignitaries and conducting affairs of state, align well enough with the archaeological evidence to confirm the palace's general character, if not every specific detail. What rose above all of this, visible from the palace's elevated position across the entire city, were the temples that defined Babylon's spiritual as much as its physical skyline. Etemenanki, the Sumerian name meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth, rose from Babylon's center in a series of massive stepped platforms that accumulated toward the sky in a form ancient peoples throughout the region understood immediately as a mountain reaching toward the divine realm. Modern scholarly consensus estimates that Etemenanki reached a height of approximately 90 meters, roughly the height of a 30-story building, though reconstructions vary and complete certainty remains elusive given the structure's thorough destruction in antiquity. What is not in doubt is the ziggurat's visual and symbolic dominance over the city around it, its summit visible from many miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, its base occupying a rectangular footprint approximately 90 meters on each side and surrounded by an extensive temple compound of priests' houses, storerooms, and subsidiary shrines. The ziggurat's surface was likely finished in glazed bricks of different colors at different levels, creating a visual progression from deep blue at the base toward the small shrine at the summit that housed the deity's earthly residence. Herodotus, the Greek historian who may have visited Babylon in the 5th century BC, described the ziggurat with evident amazement, noting the golden furniture and the couch where the god was understood to rest during his nighttime presence in the shrine. Whether Etemenanki directly inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel remains debated, but the structural and geographic correspondence is remarkable enough that most scholars consider the connection highly probable. Beyond the temple walls, the city's markets were awakening to another day. Babylon's markets operated with the commercial complexity of a city that stood at the intersection of some of the ancient world's most important trade routes, receiving goods from regions as distant as India, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Arabian Peninsula through networks of merchants, intermediaries, and caravan operators whose activities kept the city's economy continuously supplied with the diversity of goods that a population of perhaps 200,000 people demanded. The Euphrates River itself functioned as a commercial artery, with boats of various sizes carrying grain, dates, wool, and pottery upstream and downstream, while the river's crossing point at Babylon made the city an unavoidable waypoint for overland trade moving between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean world. In the markets, a visitor would encounter cedar timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan, gold from Egypt, and the aromatic spices and resins from Arabian trade networks that Babylonian temples burned in their religious ceremonies and wealthy households displayed as luxury goods. Babylonian merchants operated with sophisticated commercial instruments, contracts written on clay tablets, letters of credit, interest-bearing loans that enabled long-distance trade without requiring merchants to carry large quantities of precious metal on dangerous roads. The tumkarum, or professional merchant, occupied a recognized and respected position within Babylonian society, operating under both the commercial advantages and the legal protections that Hammurabi's code and its successors had established. The city's commercial energy never fully paused. Babylon never truly slept. Behind the monumental public architecture and the international commercial activity, Babylon was populated by hundreds of thousands of ordinary people whose daily lives documented in an extraordinary number of surviving clay tablets, recording everything from rental agreements and sales contracts to letters and legal disputes, reveal a sophisticated, literate, and remarkably organized urban society. A typical Babylonian family of modest means lived in a mud brick house of perhaps 3 to 4 rooms arranged around a central courtyard, its thick walls providing insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, its flat roof offering sleeping space during the hot months, and a work surface for drying food during harvest seasons. Children received education through apprenticeship in family trades for most occupations, but scribal schools, the ajuba, or tablet houses, provided more formal instruction for those entering administrative or priestly careers, their curriculum combining basic literacy and numeracy with the more specialized knowledge required for accounting, correspondence, or legal work. Babylonian cuisine centered on grain in various forms, bread, beer, porridge, supplemented by fish from the rivers and canals, dates from the palm groves that lined the waterways, vegetables cultivated in the irrigated gardens surrounding the city, and occasional meat from sheep and cattle for households that could afford it. Beer was not merely a luxury, but a daily dietary staple, with workers' rations frequently specified in liters of beer alongside quantities of grain. Knowledge, however, went well beyond practical literacy in Babylon. Babylon's astronomers represent one of antiquity's most remarkable intellectual achievements, developing over centuries of systematic observation a body of astronomical knowledge whose accuracy and sophistication astonishes modern scientists who study the surviving clay tablet records. Babylonian skywatchers maintained detailed records of celestial phenomena going back centuries, accumulating databases of planetary positions, eclipse occurrences, and lunar cycles that eventually enabled them to develop mathematical models capable of predicting these events with genuine accuracy. The Saros cycle, the approximately 18-year period after which eclipses repeat in predictable sequences, was identified and codified by Babylonian astronomers, allowing them to predict lunar eclipses centuries before Greek astronomers developed competing methods. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, recording systematic observations of Venus's appearances as morning and evening star over 21 years, represent some of the oldest systematic astronomical data records in human history. Babylonian mathematical astronomy, particularly as developed in the last centuries BC, achieved a level of predictive accuracy in calculating planetary positions that was not substantially improved upon until the development of heliocentric models in the 16th century AD. These were not simply practical astronomical observations serving agricultural or religious calendrical needs, though they served those purposes too. They represented genuine scientific inquiry, the careful accumulation and analysis of empirical data in pursuit of patterns that could reveal the underlying orderly structure of the observable universe. Babylon's empire was simultaneously reaching its greatest political extent. At the height of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, the Neo-Babylonian Empire controlled a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the borders of Egypt in the west, encompassing Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levantine coast, and the former Assyrian heartland that Babylon had destroyed in alliance with the Medes. This vast empire was administered through a network of governors, military commanders, and local rulers operating under Babylonian authority, their activities coordinated through the administrative machinery of the capital and communicated via an extensive system of messengers moving between cities along roads and waterways that the Babylonians maintained for precisely this purpose. Tribute and tax revenues flowing into Babylon from this extensive imperial network funded the construction projects that made the capital magnificent, while simultaneously supporting the military establishment that kept subject peoples compliant. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns extended Babylonian power to its geographic limits, the most historically significant being his sieges and final destruction of Jerusalem between 597 and 586 BC. Events recorded in the Hebrew Bible with evident trauma and whose archaeological evidence confirms the general outline of the biblical account. The Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people following Jerusalem's fall produced one of the most significant cultural and theological developments in religious history, as Israelite religious traditions were transformed by the exile experience into the form of Judaism that would eventually give rise to Christianity and Islam. Babylon was at the absolute center of the ancient world. No city anywhere was more powerful. A new empire, however, was already approaching. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon without the military siege and violent conquest that the city's formidable defensive infrastructure might have led observers to expect. The circumstances of Babylon's fall to Persian forces remain somewhat debated among historians, but ancient sources, including both the Cyrus Cylinder, which presents Cyrus's own account of the event, and the Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian administrative record, suggest that the city fell with relatively limited resistance, possibly because internal political tensions within the late Neo-Babylonian Empire had weakened both the will and the ability to mount an effective defense. Cyrus presented his conquest not as the destruction of Babylon, but as its liberation from the last Neo-Babylonian king, Nabonidus, whose controversial religious policies had alienated Babylon's powerful priestly establishment. The Cyrus Cylinder, now housed in the British Museum, records Cyrus's claim to have been welcomed by Babylon's population and to have respected the city's temples and religious traditions, an account whose propagandistic purposes are evident, but whose basic accuracy regarding peaceful Persian takeover most historians accept. The city survived the conquest physically intact, its temples maintained, its administrative systems preserved, and its commercial life continuing much as before, with the significant difference that its revenues now flowed to a Persian rather than a Babylonian imperial center. The city survived, but it would change in ways that its greatest builders could never have imagined. Babylon under Persian rule maintained much of its physical magnificence and commercial importance while gradually losing the political centrality that had defined its identity under the Neo-Babylonian kings. The Achaemenid Persian emperors Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, and Xerxes recognized the city's wealth and strategic importance, using it as one of their empire's administrative capitals and occasionally residing there during their circuits of a realm that was far too vast for any single fixed capital to govern efficiently. Darius first conducted administrative and judicial business from Babylon on multiple occasions, and the city's satrap, the Persian governor, administered a rich province whose agricultural output and commercial activity contributed substantially to imperial finances. Yet, the relationship between Babylon and its Persian rulers was not always peaceful. Revolts broke out under Darius I and Xerxes, the latter responding to Babylonian rebellions with repressive measures that ancient sources to be read with appropriate skepticism describe as including the destruction of Esagil's great statue of Marduk and damage to the temple precinct itself. Whether these accounts of deliberate religious desecration are accurate or represent later propaganda remains debated, but the general trend of Babylon's declining political status under Persian rule is not in doubt. The city, that had been the world's most powerful, was becoming a provincial administrative center, its cultural and commercial importance persisting even as its political glory began to fade. Its centuries of absolute greatness were drawing toward their close. Following the conquest by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, who also entered the city without significant resistance, and similarly proclaimed respect for its traditions while planning it as the capital of his new world empire. Babylon experienced what might have been a remarkable revival of significance. Alexander reportedly planned major reconstruction projects in the city, including restoration of Esagil's ziggurat, and his sudden death in Babylon in 3323 BC at age 32 prevented the implementation of ambitions that might have restored the city's centrality. His successors, the Seleucid dynasty that eventually controlled Babylon's region, founded a new capital called Seleucia on the Tigris nearby, deliberately draining population and commercial activity from Babylon toward their new city. This relocation of political and economic energy marked the beginning of a genuinely terminal decline for Babylon, rather than merely another period of reduced status followed by eventual recovery. Population drifted away toward Seleucia and other growing centers. Temple maintenance declined as the economic base supporting the priestly establishments contracted. The great construction that had kept the city's physical fabric renewed and impressive through the Neo-Babylonian and early Persian periods ceased, leaving existing structures to deteriorate without replacement. The processes of physical decline were slow but cumulative, each decade of reduced investment compounding into progressively more evident decay. Magnificent buildings fell gradually silent, their glazed bricks loosened by centuries of weather, their mud brick cores dissolving slowly back into the earth from which Babylonian builders had fashioned them. Yet Babylon's ideas were traveling farther than its armies ever had. By the 1st century AD, travelers passing through the region where Babylon had stood found a landscape of ruin so thoroughly decayed that it bore little obvious relationship to the city's former magnificence. The glazed brick facades that had made the Ishtar Gate and Processional Way so visually extraordinary had largely collapsed, their individual bricks scattered, stolen for building material by later inhabitants of the region, or simply buried under accumulating debris. The great ziggurat's mud brick core, no longer maintained with the renewed fired brick facing that previous generations of builders had applied, eroded with each rainy season's weathering and each summer's baking heat into a shapeless mound. The Euphrates River itself gradually shifted its course, moving westward away from the city's former center and cutting off the water access that had been fundamental to Babylon's existence. Local communities continued living amid the ruins, their modest settlements occupying elevated positions on the mounds that ancient buildings had created, occasionally finding buried objects of interest but having no systematic knowledge of what lay beneath them. Arab geographers of the medieval period noted the site's existence and the local traditions associating it with the Babylon of biblical memory, but the physical remains were too buried and eroded to communicate clearly what had once stood there. For centuries, the greatest city the ancient world had ever produced lay buried and largely forgotten beneath the Iraqi plain. Explorers were about to return. European interest in Babylon's physical remains developed gradually from the 16th century onward as biblical scholarship, classical learning, and eventually scientific archaeology combined to generate curiosity about the physical reality behind the famous ancient name. Early European travelers to the region brought back accounts of large mounds and scattered baked bricks bearing cuneiform inscriptions that local inhabitants had no means of reading, objects strange enough to attract scholarly attention, but too isolated to permit meaningful interpretation. The systematic archaeological investigation of Babylon began in earnest with German excavations led by Robert Koldewey, who worked at the site continuously from 1899 to 1917 under the sponsorship of the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft. Koldewey's excavations, conducted with the methodological care and attention to architectural evidence that distinguished late 19th century scientific archaeology from the treasure hunting that had previously characterized many digs in the region, revealed the outlines of Babylon's major buildings with sufficient clarity to enable meaningful reconstruction drawings and scholarly interpretation. The Ishtar Gate and portions of the Processional Way that Koldewey excavated were partially shipped to Berlin, where the reconstructed gate became the centerpiece of the Pergamon Museum's Babylon Gallery and gave the modern world its most direct physical encounter with ancient Babylon's visual splendor. Koldewey's publication of his findings provided the foundation for every subsequent scholarly understanding of Babylon's physical layout, enabling the interpretive and eventually digital reconstructions that would allow later generations to visualize what actually remained beneath the earth. The reconstruction of Babylon as a complete, functioning city has occupied scholars, architects, and digital artists for over a century since Koldewey's initial excavations, with each generation's reconstruction reflecting both advances in scholarly understanding and improvements in the visual technologies available for rendering ancient environments. Early reconstructions, produced as architectural drawings and paintings during the early 20th century, necessarily combined firmly established archaeological evidence with imaginative extrapolation from comparative ancient Near Eastern sources, their results impressive as scholarly achievements, but inevitably speculative in ways their creators acknowledged. The 20th century's development of computer-aided design and eventually three-dimensional digital modeling transformed reconstruction possibilities fundamentally, allowing scholars to build virtual environments that could be walked through, illuminated with modeled ancient sunlight, populated with reconstructed objects and furnishings, and adjusted as new scholarly understanding revised specific interpretations. The challenge of responsible reconstruction, honestly distinguishing between what the archaeological and textual evidence firmly establishes and what represents reasoned scholarly speculation, has been addressed differently by different projects, with some prioritizing visual completeness and others emphasizing transparent uncertainty. Iraq's own reconstruction efforts during the 1980s, which constructed replica structures above the original ruins in ways that damaged underlying archaeological remains, demonstrated the problems that can arise when political and nationalistic motivations for displaying an ancient heritage override archaeological responsibility. The most rigorous current reconstructions use digital technology to create immersive experiences while maintaining scholarly honesty about the limits of available evidence. One final journey remained. Stand at the northern edge of Babylon's reconstruction and begin walking southward along the Processional Way as it would have appeared during Nebuchadnezzar's reign around 575 BC. Behind you, the Ishtar Gate rises in its full 40-foot height, its vivid blue glazed brick surface almost luminously bright in the morning sun, the dragons and bulls of its decorative program marching in their endless ceremonial procession across every surface. Before you, the broad paved avenue stretches southward, its limestone slabs smooth and precisely fitted, its flanking walls rising on both sides with their rows of marching lions. The scale is deliberately overwhelming. The visitor is made to feel small, subordinate, properly impressed by the power of the city and the deity whose processional route this is. As you proceed southward, the city opens around you on both sides. Administrative buildings, temple auxiliary structures, the houses of priests and wealthy merchants on the elevated ground, the more modest dwellings of craftspeople and laborers extending toward the city walls. The air carries the mingled scents of the ancient city. Wood smoke from cooking fires, the distinctive resinous smell of temple incense drifting from the Esagila compound ahead, the animal smells of the livestock markets, and beneath everything, the particular smell of the Euphrates, that river of rich dark water carrying the silt of distant mountains. Ahead, Etemenanke's massive bulk rises above everything, a human-made mountain at the center of the human-made world. Babylon's greatest legacy was waiting to be understood. Its walls no longer stand at their original height. The glazed bricks that once made the Ishtar Gate the most visually spectacular entrance in the ancient world are scattered, some in Berlin, some in Baghdad, most dissolved back into the Iraqi soil from which the clay that made them was once dug. The palace where Nebuchadnezzar received the ambassadors of conquered kingdoms is a series of low earthen ridges, their outlines visible to archaeologists trained to read such evidence, but communicating nothing to unprepared eyes. The ziggurat that rose 90 meters above the flat plain is a shapeless mound, its former magnificence requiring imagination and scholarship to recover. Yet Babylon never truly disappeared. Every city on Earth that was planned rather than simply growing streets, laid out before buildings, districts organized by function, public spaces designed for specific civic purposes, carries the inheritance of the urban planning tradition that Babylon exemplified when most of the world was still building villages. Every legal system that writes its laws down so that citizens can know them rather than relying on the arbitrary judgment of whoever holds power echoes the principle that Hammurabi's stele first articulated with such systematic clarity. Every astronomer who collects careful observations over years and decades to identify patterns in celestial movements is doing what Babylonian skywatchers did at the beginning of recorded scientific history. Every person who measures time using 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours uses a numerical system whose Babylonian origins persist through 3,000 years of subsequent calculation. Babylon changed civilization. Civilization has never entirely put it down.